Good evening, and welcome all of you to the Shadow Gallery. So, not for the last time. I am, as always, your host, James Donnelly. And there's this thing going around the tube right now amongst the members of the comic book community, which is we are essentially playing a sort of game of tag. And this game of tag is a Q&A video. And since I was tagged by Scott Grady, I think that's what he actually even calls himself on on YouTube. What a strange person he is to actually use his real name. Anyway, so it then falls upon me to then be the tagged one and to create a video. This video consists of nine questions. And now it is my understanding of this video that I don't know about must, but that it should be based upon mainstream books, basically Marvel or DC. So these questions are in direct relation to characters, either Marvel or DC, publishers, either Marvel or DC, so Marvel or DC. So let's start with the questions, and then I will give my answers, as is customary in a Q&A. So let's start with the first question. What is my favorite ongoing title? To be perfectly honest, this, like some of the other categories, some of the other questions, is a bit. I was a bit flummoxed by this question because it's hard to pick one favorite comic that you have that is out and is ongoing, because it's really kind of a toss-up between one or two or potentially three titles sometimes. But having kind of weighed and measured the answers, I'm going to say that my current favorite ongoing from the major publishers is Daredevil. Like I said, it's a toss-up. We're gonna break the rules. I'm gonna give you two answers because it's really a tie. It's Daredevil and Hawkeye. Because first of all, now I know that Chris Samney, hasn't quote unquote departed from, but he took a little bit of a leave from Daredevil. And another artist whose name escapes me stepped in for a bit. But Mark Waid has been there since this. Won't call it a reboot. We'll just call it a comeback. Comeback from from what had been so prevalent, really since, and I've said this before, really since pretty much the 80s, when Frank Miller was really had taken over doing Daredevil, both writing and drawing it, and then kind of bringing in guest writers, and then when it went on to other writers, they kind of still kept this one thing going, which is the Catholic guilt kind of I won't call it a trope, but definitely a very serious part, very serious element to the personality of Matt Murdock, and to the overall sensibility of the book. The book, I won't say it's not that it wasn't great when people like Frank Miller and people like Brian Michael Bendis and people like Ed Brubaker were writing it. It was pretty fucking great, but it was also not fun. And Mark Waid, being the kind of writer that he is, having a greater understanding, I think, of a more classical storytelling type, which is not to say that Mark Waid hasn't written really, really dark shit, but he has a great fondness, I think, for more Silver Agey type of material, and he just brought that same kind of sensibility into a modern comic. And, having artists like, the people that he's had, Paulo Rivera, Javier Rodriguez, Chris Samney, he's definitely brought the fun back to it, but not losing, I won't call it edgy, but not losing the gravitas that the comic should have and that the character should have. And there are certain elements of his character that have been sidelined, and that's for the better. Not for the better, it's for the different. It's a more old-fashioned take on this comic, but again, just with a modern sensibility, and that's what I love about it. Because if it kept just kind of going down the same road, because I think after Shadowland, everything kind of fell apart with Daredevil. It was just even putting on a black costume was too much, and I think that Marvel very rightly said, you know what, this guy Waid over here, he's got a good idea. Let's bring back Daredevil and bring back the Scarlet Swashbuckler, so that it is more entertaining. It's more fun. He's allowed to have fun every once in a while, and you got that right off the bat in the first issue, where he's fighting the Spot, and he, during this mob wedding, and he even takes time to steal a kiss from the bride, and that's just, that kind of sensibility is like, oh, this is going to be fun now. We're done with the never-ending depression, madness, insanity road that they've been going down for the most part. I mean, obviously, elements of that come back, but it's not so incredibly dark that it doesn't overwhelm you. So that's one reason. Another reason, and the other reason that I had to say Hawkeye is because it's Hawkeye. I mean, it's such a brilliant book. Matt Fraction and David Aja have made a wonderful team since their first kind of, teaming up when they did Immortal Iron Fist together, and that was a magical book. And Hawkeye, just the idea of workaday, superhero, kind of the regular Joe of the Avengers, just kind of going through his day to day, and having incredibly funny moments, really action packed moments, big moments, small moments, and putting both Clint Barton and Kate Bishop into this book, making them, so that he can trade focal points if he wants to, and he has. And then, guest artists like Francesco Francavilla, Annie Wu. I mean, it's so, and Javier Pulido. I mean, it's such a great book. So I won't get too much into that, but it was such a new idea, and there's a great column right now on ComicsAlliance.com about what they're now referring to with Marvel and its Hawkeyeization of a lot of its newer titles. Is that they want to bring that same kind of sensibility to a lot of the new comics that are coming out now. And they specifically compared it to the new Black Widow book that just came out this week. And that's really good. I recommend it. But anyway, so moving on. We spent 10 minutes on just one question. Hey, stick around, kids. You know it's going to be long. So favorite team book. That was pretty much a no-brainer for me. My favorite team book by far is Superior Foes of Spider-Man. I mean, Nick Spencer, Steve Lieber creating such a wonderful title that really kind of harkens back to the fun that I used to have. Not quite as evil as the fun that I used to have with Secret Six, but you know, it's a different comic than that, obviously, but it has a similar vibe, and not just the fact that it's about a group of villains, but it's more specifically about the fact that it's a group of villains that suck. And I mean, the fact that it's called the Superior Foes of Spider-Man, I don't know if there's some metatextual subtext to that. The fact that, you know, you have this book, The Superior Foes of Spider-Man, where all the foes are shitty, they're just bad supervillains, and then, you know, whether that's a commentary on what's going on in Superior Spider-Man itself. So that, you know, obviously you could argue that it's you know, one way or the other. I'm sure that it's not, but I kind of like to daydream sometimes that it is. So that, you know, Superior Foes of Spider-Man is just brilliant. I mean, you know, like books like All New X-Men, that's, you know, Wolverine and the X-Men, these are really good books, but they're just not nearly as good as Superior Foes of Spider-Man. And it's a book that is, from my understanding, still not doing very well, and you should be buying it because it needs to keep on going. So, favorite hero. Favorite hero, again, this one is pretty easy. There's a reason that I have this tattoo, and the other one up here is because my favorite hero is still Batman, and he always will be. Scott, in his video that I watched, you know, was speaking kind of very anecdotally about that his favorite is Spider-Man, which I understand very significantly, because that was kind of his entrance into the world of comic books. And for me, my entrance into the world of comic books was Batman. And that was partially because the TV show, obviously not still airing, you know, when I was a kid, but it was, you know, it had been syndicated and, you know, obviously showing reruns and everything like that, and I kind of really loved it. And then I started reading the comic, and I had, you know, as I'm sure I've brought out before, my old book, Batman from the 30s to the 70s. I mean, that was that, and it was Spider-Man. But Spider-Man has never had, really, with the exception of some of the stuff from the last 3 or 4 years when Dan Slott took it over, it never really had a very literary sensibility to it. There's never been a Spider-Man comic where you could point to and say, I'm not talking about, you know, as a series or an arc, that you could point to and say, you know what, that's iconic. I mean, maybe prior to arcs like Spider Island and No One Dies and you know, Revenge of the Spider Slayers that Dan Slott did so brilliantly. The only one that you could really point to is the DeMatteis and Mike Zeck, you know, Craven's Final Hunt, or the Last Hunt. That's the only one, because every comic that came out after some, you know, like The Dark Knight Returns, you know, every hero had to turn dark, at least for a bit. You know, giving Spider-Man the dark suit was particularly, it was a move in a different direction. If you even think back to the cover of Web of Spider-Man #1, it's him with the black outfit perched on top of gargoyles and everything like that. It's a very Batman looking book. And so, I mean, it's just that, Batman is a great character because specifically, that against, I shouldn't say against all odds, because he was born extraordinarily wealthy, but, that he is an obsessive man. And that has both its good points and its bad points. That he has a very strict code that has unfortunately cost probably literally thousands of people their lives. So to create a character that is that morally inflexible is a pretty remarkable thing, especially to a character like Batman, because, I mean, even as we look at him in his darkest future days, or maybe alternate universe days, he never crosses that line, even though he desperately wants to. So you get it. You just really get it. That, I mean, Batman is fighting a war he can never possibly win. And it's because of that code that he will save some lives, and he will lose people. He will lose people that are close to him. So it's a very difficult character to write well for, yet so many really talented people have done it pretty much flawlessly. Obviously, there have been some really shitty ones too, but I mean, that's, he's the gold standard as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I know people will argue Superman and Wolverine and, a bunch of other characters, but it's just he's the man. He's the classic. He's the hero that even the the most powerful of the DC universe kind of look up to when he's at his best. Unfortunately, when he's at his worst, that's usually when people decide that, okay, well, he needs to be reined in, or he needs to be kicked out of the Justice League, or whatever. So, moving on. Favorite villain. This one was a really tough one for me, because there are so many great villains out there. But really what it came down to was that the one I just kept coming back to over and over and over again is Ra's al Ghul, or Ra's al Ghul, however, because obviously it could be kind of pronounced either way. You've seen it pronounced, you've heard it pronounced that way in the films, in the Batman films. You've also heard on the animated series, the Batman animated series, that it was that he pronounced it Ra's al Ghul. I liked the pronunciation of Ra's as opposed to Raz, because Raz is just, it doesn't sound kind of foreign enough. I don't mean, it doesn't sound quite, it's just kind of bland, it's kind of the, the soft A, the Raz, it's like Ra's, it's like, it just kind of almost hurts your mouth to say it. So anyway, but the reason for that being is that really he's kind of, for many years, he's been my favorite villain, because obviously, as he is the best counterpoint to one of the greatest heroes that I've ever seen, because he literally has the same he has the same goals in many ways that Batman does. He wants to eradicate crime. He wants to bring the world into a harmonious existence. Which I think if you really took away, if you stripped away the things that Batman does, you'll find that at his core, it's not just about the war on crime. It is that he's trying to make the world better. So it's two characters with similar goals, with similar physical attributes, and and similar mental capacity. They're both brilliant. They're both detectives in their own way, and they're both, inordinately wealthy. And but one of them, unfortunately, is trying to essentially commit genocide, looking to wipe out most of the world and keep a manageable population that can start fresh and rebuild the world anew. And he's, just the character of Ra's al Ghul, as he's, progressed over the years and had different parts of his story told, has just become a more fascinating character. So it's just, he's just a great character, and I think that he may always be my favorite villain, even if it didn't start out that way. Because I would have said probably, a character like the Joker or the Green Goblin or Lex Luthor or what have you. But the reason is that he's such a perfect, you flip the coin, obviously if you've seen like the cover for, the Killing Joke, on the old trade, it had, the two halves of the same playing card, Batman on one and the Joker on the other. And, if you were to flip a coin, that's kind of what people would normally expect you to say, is that as far as Batman's greatest nemesis is the Joker. Well, on paper, probably, because obviously he's killed more people that are in Batman's life, and probably just killed more people, period, than Ra's al Ghul has. But Ra's al Ghul, it's like, if you've seen the film GoldenEye, that's one of the reasons that's one of my favorite of the Bond films, and one of the reasons that Alec Trevelyan is my favorite Bond villain ever, is that because he didn't require a henchman. He was, again, the same level of intellect and same physical level of, of combat as Batman. So it's great stuff. Great villain. Moving on. So the question, Marvel or DC? This one's pretty easy. Marvel. I'm getting a lot more Marvel books than I am DC right now. The reason for that being is that a lot of really good books have either gotten canceled from DC, or they've switched creative teams so much that it gets just really irritating. And Marvel tends to kind of stay the course. And it's just, there are so many more interesting books coming out of Marvel now than probably ever before. They're really playing around with that universe. And that is usually pretty exciting. Sometimes they play around with it too much and they break it. And we'll get to that in a bit. But for right now, let's just say, yeah, it's definitely Marvel for me. Least favorite book. this one's really hard for me because I don't read books that I don't like. But if I were to name a book that I read that was just like, oh God, because I just wanted to try it out and see if it got better, and it didn't, is Justice League. Jeff Johns, to me, has kind of always been a really hit or miss writer. I really liked what he was doing with Aquaman for a while, but I just kind of lost interest, to be perfectly honest. Um, because he always has these pet characters that he wants to play around with and bring back or take away or whatever. I mean, like Vibe, who gives a shit about Vibe? Um, but anyway, um, but Justice League, it's just so bland. It's so lifeless to me. It just it just relies so heavily on the the very specific tropes of every character that to that it just kind of gets dull because it just doesn't feel like, okay, well, these are individual characters. No, these are the stock. These are they take the basest elements of the characters and just plop them in there and go for as much, kind of gonzo kind of combat as you could possibly think of, rather than stripping it down and actually giving characters character beats. So that's a book that just has always bugged me, and I really I tried to hang with it for a little while because people kept talking about it, and it just doesn't work for me at all, really at all. I mean, artistically, it's a neat book, but other than that, I'd say it's book that I like that other people hate. This is a really difficult one also because I don't tend to read a lot of books that other people really don't seem to care for, with really one kind of gigantic exception, and that's Superior Spider-Man. I understand where the hatred comes from. I really do. But I think it's gotten kind of cool to pick on this book because it's so different, obviously, from what came before. Killing off Peter Parker, quote unquote, killing him off, is it's an easy thing to throw. It's an easy target. And I'm not saying that people that are out there that hate it that they hate it for bad reasons. They have their reasons, and I'm sure some of them are valid. There are issues of this book that I've hated. I mean, I've really hated. I mean, in the very beginning, there were a couple of issues of this comic that I thought were absolutely awful. They were like 0 stars. But then the book brought me back. And I talked about this in my year-end video, that issue 9 of Superior Spider-Man was one of my favorite single issues of last year. And I still read it, and I still enjoy it. Because it's like, that was an interesting thing, because once that happened, the book turned around, I think. And like the character of Anna Maria, it's just I think that Slott has created something that is kind of blasphemous to a number of people, and I can understand why. I just don't, and believe me, like I said, I've loved Spider-Man since I was a kid too. But because of Dan Slott's pretty stellar run with this book, I had to say to myself, you know what, I have to give this a chance. And, you know, even though there were times where I thought that Slott was really letting me down, I still hung on and I got good things out of it. So Superior Spider-Man, I guess, is really the only book that I could say that I like kind of a lot, that a lot of other people hate. I mean, people hate this book with a seething passion. So that's where I'm coming from. Favorite event book. So I'm sorry, there are 10 questions. I forgot about this one. Favorite event book of all time. Obviously, 1985 brought the year of the beginning of the event books. Because you had in that 1 year, you had two huge crossover titles that bled into most of the respective universes. On Marvel's side, you had Marvel Superheroes Secret Wars, and then on the other side, you had Crisis on Infinite Earths from DC. I would pretty easily say that Crisis on Infinite Earths is better than Secret Wars, but Secret Wars is the one that I read more often because it has some funky twists and turns that are involved in it. But anyway, and since then, there's been pretty much every year, there's been the competition between the two companies. Okay, well, we got to have another crossover. We got to have another event title. So it kind of kept going throughout the years. And then in 1 year in particular, there was, and they all kind of sucked. I mean, the only one I think from maybe like the late 80s, early 90s that I thought was a cool event idea was Acts of Vengeance that Marvel did, where everybody kind of switched up who their, the particular villains kind of switched up which heroes to fight. This kind of cabal of, 5 villains kind of at the head of this, Magneto and the Red Skull and Doctor Doom and the Wizard, and there's another one, I can't remember who it is. But they all kind of switched tactics so that maybe that the other, they could defeat the, anyway. But then in this last 14 years or so, it's been they've been getting a little bit more ambitious with the ideas that they were creating. And a lot of people have probably used this already, and it's one that I'm going to pull out too, because it just works on pretty much every level, except for a few. And that is Civil War, Marvel's Civil War. As we've seen in recent years with many of the companies, they do kind of decide that there needs to be a book where heroes fight heroes. And it's supposed to rewrite the status quo and shake it up, and there's supposed to be, everything's supposed to change after these events. Well, of course, it never lives up to that promise. Whether it's Secret Invasion, or whether it's House of M, or whether it's Fear itself, or whether it's whatever, Atlantis Attacks, I mean, that's really old. But they never do. I mean, the ones, Final Crisis, and, yes, that did kind of shake up the status quo a little bit, but the only thing that really kind of came out of that was it brought Flash. It brought the Barry Allen Flash back. You know, so I mean, DC's just as guilty, if not more guilty, of this than Marvel is. Because frankly, I can't think of any DC event comics that have worked, that have been within the continuity of what DC was doing at the time. But Civil War, even though I kind of hate Mark Millar right now, and have for a while, I still can't stop thinking about when I loved him. And, Civil War, its greatest strength, obviously, was that it framed an argument. That it worked to not just to polarize the actual characters themselves, but to polarize the readers as well. Because they both have valid arguments. Iron Man says, let's register so that they don't shut us all down. And we get to keep doing what we're doing. And we get, benefits, we get paid, we get health care. I mean, this seems like it's a no-brainer, right? I mean, that sounds kind of good to me. But then here's Cap, who says, you know what? This is really infringing on our civil liberties because we are fighting crime and we're not asking for reward. We are, we are doing it because it is the right thing to do, not just to get a paycheck on it. And I don't want people knowing who I really am. Some other characters, some other heroes don't want people to know their real identities. And they also don't want to be at the beck and call of whatever administration is in charge of these heroes to send them out on missions to do God knows what. So, I mean, that's also a really strong and compelling argument. So, obviously Iron Man and kind of the big brains, kind of were the more pragmatic ones, and you had, Captain America and his kind of ideologues. And, obviously with, like the Steve McNiven art, there were moments of the book that didn't work for me. Like, Thor killing Goliath, or Ragnarok, I should call him, because it's Thor's clone. It's like, well, if you really want to do that, let's, if you really want to kill somebody, let's shake it up a little more. But of course, that came later, that came after, in the death of Captain America. And that actually did shake up the status quo for about 2 years, until they decided, well, it's time for him to come back. It's time for Steve Rogers to come back. And when he did, it was kind of cool because even though he came back much earlier than I would have preferred, he came back, and then out of that we got the Winter Soldier book, which was awesome. At least when Brubaker was working on it. Anyway, but like I said, it's a book that framed an argument that was, on an intellectual level, for every reader, it spoke to them. And it said, you know what? This is actually pretty compelling stuff. And I love the fact that it ended the way that it did. That, there's that moment where, Spider-Man, after he's flip-flopped between the pro-reg to the anti-reg side, that, the big fight is going on, and all of this kind of, in New York, and kind of all hell is being unleashed around these heroes fighting each other, and and Spidey says, hey, and Cap stops the fight and basically says, and Spidey says, but we were winning. And Cap kind of looks around, and he's like, no, we weren't. We might have been winning the fight, but we're not. it's just, that he just kind of walks away. It's just, at this point in time, we're just now looking for an excuse to fight each other. And that, I think, also was kind of a metatextual argument about these types of books, that they seem to create them merely to have heroes fighting other heroes. But even though this time they had a good reason. And there were even issues, that were the tie-in issues, where some of them actually did sit down to try and talk, which is what I liked about Civil War. Just the whole general idea of it. I mean, yes, the main issues are kind of big and fighty, but the peripheral issues, as they spread out, worked on an individual level, because some of them were just about the conversation that they should be having. And that was kind of a wonderful thing. So yeah, Civil War, I would say, is my favorite event comic, probably of all time. Like I said, that takes place in continuity. Least favorite event comic, Jesus Christ. I mean, there are so many to choose from. But when I really look back at it and I really locate the one that just fucking makes me want to punch people, it's almost a tie, but ultimately the winner by infuriating knockout is the recent AVX, Avengers vs. X-Men. It was just so awful. I mean, it hurt. It hurt inside. Because there was stuff that was going on, again, in some of the peripheral titles, and some of the tie-ins, that was really good. But then you had this main 12-issue event that was like, okay, well, here's gonna be the Brubaker issue, and here are gonna be the Bendis issues, and here's gonna be the Fraction issue, and here's gonna be the Aaron issue. And there was no... It just got so insane with so many things that it was trying to tie together, that it just lost its way completely. The art, from Romita Jr. sucked, frankly. Near the end, it kind of picked back up because they got, I think Olivier Coipel was an artist, maybe for an issue or two. I think Andy Kubert, however they're pronouncing their last name. I think he was an artist for an issue or so. But the writing just was excruciating, with the exception of one issue, which was the Jason Aaron issue. That was actually a pretty good issue. But it just sucked. It just was so bad. And the only real other event comic that I really hate nearly as much as that is DC's Flashpoint. But thankfully that only lasted for 5 issues. But this had to be stretched out over 12 issues, and every fucking, comic book that involved these characters had to get involved too. So it was just painfully bad for so many reasons, except for some of the great issues that it did yield, particularly in Bendis and Deodato's New Avengers title. Was pretty masterful. That was the only book that actually was still really, really good while AVX was going on. That had to do with one of these two teams. So AVX though is the biggest loser, believe me. And so we'll wrap this up by the obvious, what is easily the weirdest question of all, which is favorite prison, favorite comic prison. I know that kind of the easy one is Arkham Asylum, but I mean, let's face it, that's a really shitty prison. I mean, everybody gets out. I mean, it is literally at will. It's just like, okay, well, it's, you know, even Scott in his video said it's a revolving door. I mean, they go in, they get out, and it's never they get out because they're released because they've been treated properly. No, they get out because they break out. It's the shittiest, you know, it's the shittiest prison. It's the shittiest, you know, confinement facility ever. It's just awful. But my favorite comic prison of all time, gosh, this was one I kind of agonized over because there aren't really any good ones. But because, again, the revolving door aspect. But really my favorite is, and this is based merely on the idea of it, was, I can't even remember exactly what it's called, but I think it was Item 47, or Idea 47, or whatever exactly it was, where that actually also came out of Civil War, which was basically Reed Richards and Hank Pym, etc., were using the negative zone to hold their prisoners. I thought that was pretty brilliant. That was just, like I said, as an idea that worked. And I think that that's a good prison. But you have, you know, obviously, you know, you have the Raft, and you have Iron Heights, and you have, I don't know, I mean, Rikers, but Rikers is a real place, so you can't really say too much about that. But I did love that particular arc of Daredevil, where Matt Murdock is in Rikers. And of course, he ends up there with the Kingpin and with Bullseye. So that was pretty awesome. But yeah, I mean, as far as an idea is concerned, an idea for a prison, that seemed to be the one that probably would work the best. But that didn't stick around for too long, I don't think. So, but anyway, so that's it. Those are the 10 questions. And those are my answers. So I hope that you find them satisfactory. Hey, if you're new here, subscribe. If you're not, you obviously don't need to. Just don't unsubscribe. Because like I said, the Shadow Gallery will be back from time to time to talk about comics and talk about films and talk about, you know, genre entertainment. Yeah. So that's it for now. Thank you very much for coming by. It's my turn to tag people. That is honestly going to come later because I do need to do a little bit more research into who actually has been tagged and who hasn't. Because I know this is kind of going around opening the floodgates, and I don't know, honestly, who has been tagged yet. So that will come later, but it will come probably within the next day or so. So watch out, people. You might be next. So until then, thanks for coming by. Again, comment, like, dislike, but mostly comment. And, you know, as per all of, you know, as per my... You're free to comment, criticize, complain, whatever, but just don't be a dick, okay? I had that on one of my recent videos, and it's unpleasant. we don't want that. We don't need it. And it doesn't work for anybody but the person that's writing it for their own gratification. So if you're going to be a dick, you're going to get, you're just being a dick. So don't be a dick. So thank you again for watching. I know it's been a long one. And we'll say goodbye now. So long from the Shadow Gallery, and, stay in the shadows.